Hi, this is Claudia Filos with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and I'm so delighted to be here today with friends and colleagues from Hour 25, and especially I'm delighted to welcome Arti Mehta, who is here to join us today to talk about Aesop and Fables. Arti, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everyone.
Arti, before we get going, I just want to share a little bit of information about your interest and your background. I want to let everyone know that you earned a PhD in classics from Indiana University, where you studied ancient fables and popular literature through the medium of folklore, rhetoric, and literary criticism. You're currently in the process of turning your dissertation into a book. The title of the dissertation is How Do Fables Teach the World of the Fable in Greece, India, and Rome? So that should give people an idea of the breadth of your knowledge, which is so exciting. You can really help us think in exciting ways today. And I also want to let everyone know that right now you're teaching ancient languages and literature at Howard University. So thank you. I know you're very busy right now, but we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Oh, this is such a treat for me and a great pleasure to be invited to join you all, so I appreciate it.
Okay, well, let's get the ball rolling. Many of our community members have thought a great deal about Homer, about the Odyssey, but maybe some of us are more familiar with the fables from the kind of stories that we read as a kid, right? Because these are the kind of stories we tend to think about then, but somehow I think oftentimes we stop reading them. But I think they're very important, and I'm hoping you could help us think about how to think about them in a new way. So where do we begin with fables and Aesop?
Where do we begin with fables and Aesop? Well, I guess I could ask the question that I was thinking of asking for the group discussion today, which is really to say, who is Aesop, or who was Aesop? What sort of person was he, and what did he do that made him so interesting to us? Can we say that he was simply a storyteller, maybe that he was the first person to tell stories with animals that spoke, okay? Or was it just that he was the best at this kind of storytelling? Or even that he could use these stories rhetorically better than anybody else? Okay. So I'd like to say that in addition to his leading the field in these ways, all right, I'm really interested in how he functions as a character himself in the narratives we have that talk about him. So far, so good. Okay. So I would raise the question to you all, too, based on your knowledge of Homer and the poems of Homer, Hesiod, the archaic age poems. Would Aesop be considered simply an eponymous hero because he gives his name to this tradition? Or was he more of a folk hero who was celebrated for his wit, maybe even a little bit more than his wisdom? So these are the kinds of questions I'd like to think about today. If you think in terms of folklore, you might have read Hesiod's fable on the hawk and the nightingale. Does this one sound familiar to us? Okay, yes. And so there we have this rapacious raptor, right? The hawk who's grabbed the nightingale and wants to eat it, basically. And the poor little nightingale is pleading for its life. It's singing for its freedom. And, unfortunately, Hesiod does not let the nightingale go. Okay. But this is the kind of story that we want to think about, these traditional stories and the way they're told in folklore when we consider who Aesop was. Now, you may have heard from the life of Aesop that Aesop was often considered to be a slave, that whether he came from Phrygia or whether he lived on the island of Samos or any of these variables exist, but he was considered to be a slave. And as we know, the slaves in the ancient world were often smarter than their masters, right? So eventually, in the life of Aesop, he gets freed because of his intelligence, because he's able to save his masters from enough perils that he's rewarded with his freedom. And he rises through the ranks to become advisor to first, like I said, first his master, then to the local mayor or somebody along those lines, and then eventually to a couple of kings. All right. So the question is, who really was he? And again, what I find so interesting about him is the folklore side of the story, where really you see him engaged in everyday life activities, right? And you see him as a very creative figure in these few instances that we have of him as a character and not just as a storyteller. All right, so far so good. I'd like to just spend a tiny bit of time mentioning Plato's Phaedo, where he has Socrates, right, in the jail, where he's waiting for the moment when he's about to be, you know, when the end is near, and he's occupying himself by turning the fables of Aesop into verse form, right? And then, of course, he gets interrupted, and the whole idea goes to naught. But I'd like to draw some parallels for our audience between Aesop and Socrates, right? So we can safely say that Aesop, like Socrates, never wrote anything down himself. We could also say that there's no such book like Aesop's, you know, the life lessons, you know, just a few short fables, that kind of book from Aesop. We also know that this kind of intersection of the end of Socrates' life and the memory of Aesop's life seems to be a turning point for the Greek wisdom tradition. As of the death of Socrates, what we get is Socrates so much celebrated in Plato's writings, right, that he becomes the star attraction, so to speak. Right? He becomes the center of all the dialogues of Plato as the main interlocutor. And therefore, Socrates becomes or enters the space of what I would call the mainstream, right, and even high culture, because Plato is such an important figure himself. Okay, Aesop, on the other hand, what happens to him is that once again we get people just mentioning his name and then moving on. And I'm not saying that he's offended or anything, okay, but I'm suggesting that we have such a well-rounded character in Socrates because he's repeated as a character and reintroduced in each dialogue of Plato, that we get to see how he becomes the focus of the philosophical discussions and the focus of ideas of truth and justice and forms of goodness, right? But Aesop, on the other hand, I think, by disappearing from this kind of a serious conversation, ends up just making these cameo appearances in many, many, many different authors' works in the ancient world and subsequently. Okay, so I think of him, and specifically the name of Aesop, as simply the kind of peg on which we hang the narrative of the fable. Right? Because we don't seem to have that much detail about who he was. And if you remember in Homer, the bards would always take the peg and hang their lyre on top of it, right? So this is the justification for using the aesthetic move of hanging your name on that peg. Okay. Okay. Last thing I'd like to say before we open up to questions and maybe some readings is these ideas of the fable. The fable is in the ancient world in Greek called ainoi, logoi, or muthoi, 3 different terms that we use to describe fables. And I'd like to suggest that fables can actually, in these different terms, reflect something about the nature of Aesop himself. Now, the ainos, you might know, is the riddle form of the fable, right? And I'm sure that many people in your group have read Greg Nage's Best of the Chians, since you're all about the hero. And so there he talks about the Aesopic ainos, right, where Aesop in Delphi is so determined to tell his fables to the Delphinians, I can't even say it right, okay, that he ends up irritating them to the point that they decide to treat him as a scapegoat, and therefore, you know, it leads to his death. All right. So I find this term interesting because here is Aesop, who's meant to instruct others in how to improve their own lives in order that they may survive these kinds of social pitfalls, and he ends up giving in to his hubris, if you will. All right. So the next term is logos, and we see logos used as narrative, a simple narrative, when we get to Aristotle and his treatment of Aesopic fables. Okay. Around the same time, we have the great immersion of prose, right? Basically, since Herodotus, we have all these prose versions of Aesopic fables. And Herodotus specifically calls Aesop a logopoios, so a tale maker, if you will, when he talks about the story of the dancing fish. Okay? So here too, we see that the logos can serve as a form of evidence, a form of proof, according to Aristotle, as long as you're dealing with an audience of the general masses, right? The general public. All right, so Aesop, once again, has the capacity to turn into a demagogue by leading the people, and his success or his failure depends entirely on his ability to persuade the group. Okay. The last term I'd like to mention is the term mythos, especially as it is defined by Theon, who is one of the teachers of rhetoric in the Common Era. People say the 2nd century of the Common Era, and he defines fable as a mythos, or a false story picturing truth. Right? And this idea is fascinating to me. The idea that when we tell a fable, we're actually creating a visual image in our audience's mind, right? So that we allow the audience to basically walk into the landscape of the fable, right? And I think this is part of the secret of how we, as the listeners to the fable, are able to accept it into our own world and our own lives to learn what lesson we can from it. How's that so far?
Amazing. And what's, I think, so interesting for us is that we have thought, I think many of our community members who have participated in Hero Sex, we have thought about Ainos and Mutos and Logos. So we're familiar with these terms, but I think you're giving us a sort of a new way to think about them, which is so exciting.
Excellent.
So okay, can we take a second to have some questions, maybe?
Sure, that would be great.
Hi, Arti. Welcome to our 25. Oh, we have. Hi.
Yeah, we're having a little bit of an echo here.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just write my question because we don't have echo from Arti, and then you can respond. So in the meantime,
I can hear you fine.
Yes, but we have echo of the recording.
Yes, this would not be good.
Yes, so I'll just write it. So please continue, and I'll write my question in the meantime.
Okay. I don't know, Claudia. Were you thinking of we could go to one of the focus passages?
We can. I think. I don't think we're getting echo right now, are we? Good. Okay. Sarah, did you want to try and read the focus passage if we have no echo?
Okay, we'll try. It sounds okay for me. Is everyone else okay? I'll start with number 1. The fables are making a visit to Aesop. They are fond of him because he takes care of them. For while Homer and Hesiod also did for fable, and furthermore Archilochus in his Lycambes, Aesop, however, makes all the affairs of men into fables. He shared the ability to speak with animals in order to express human thought, since he cuts short greedy behavior and drives away insolence and deceit. A lion explains these points for him, and a fox, and a horse, and by Zeus, even the tortoise is not without a voice. Through these animals, children come to learn the affairs of life. And so the fables, since they are honoured because of Aesop, wait at the wise man's door to tie ribbons in his hair and to crown him with a wreath of olive shoots. And I suppose he is weaving a fable as his smile and his eyes fastened on the ground show this. The painter knows that the concerns of fables require that the spirit be at ease. The painting even inquires into the persons of the fables, because it places the wild animals joining with men, chorus around Aesop, all together representing his players. The fox is painted as the leader of the chorus, because Aesop uses him as a messenger for most of his themes, just as comedy makes use of Daos.
That was beautiful. So Arti, I think Tim has a question. Can you see that, Arti?
Oh, yes. Can we read the question just so that we...
Yes, please, yes. Other people can't see it, so if you read that out loud, that'd be great. Or it's a comment, really.
Oh, who, me?
Yes.
Okay. It's gone now.
Oh, okay, I can see it. So Timothy's asking, isn't it interesting that children are called out as the primary audience in this, which implies the primary goal of the fables? Do you have a reaction to that?
Yes, of course. It's fascinating that we want to give children this access to the animal world. I don't know if we can ever get away from the idea that children are the primary audience of fables, except for people like me who likes to read them all the time.
Great. And Janet also has a question. She's asking, using animals in fables, what is that tradition, and do we have a sense of where that comes from?
That's an excellent question. There is a lot of the fable form in ancient Mesopotamia, a good 1,000 years or more before Aesop, and those fables are even more, how shall I say it, striking than the Aesopic ones. There's the attribution of human characteristics to animals has probably been going on as long as humans have been able to articulate what they see animals doing, is my guess.
And can you help us think some more about this focus passage? Why did you select this for us to consider today?
Well, actually, I was going to ask you all what you thought of this idea, what you thought of this visualization of Aesop in the midst of his characters and his fables, right? So I was hoping that you all would see something in that I have already lost.
All right, guys. So what do we think about this? I love this idea of. Go, Sarah.
I was very struck by that image of him as part of a chorus, but that the fox is the chorus leader, not Aesop himself. And I was also thinking about which animals are associated with which characteristics as well. And the fox, it says he's often used as a messenger, but the messenger is necessarily the person who's actually saying this is what it means. It's more by demonstration, isn't it?
Sorry, what you say is very interesting. I think the term for the fox as the chorus leader is not what we would expect chorigos. It's chore phyla, I believe is the proper term here, and therefore I reserve the right to call Aesop the didaskalos, who is still the trainer of the chorus, rather than simply a chorus leader, right? How are we doing?
There's also.
So I'm seeing some of the questions about the gender question about the fox, and the Greek words for fox, allopex, and kerdo, which we've talked about in the past, both happen to be feminine. And I think we can safely assume that there is a certain bias that the female is the tricky one in among the genders. And so, but I claim it, okay? I say we're happy to have the fox on our side. And if it makes any sense, maybe in our modern world we could think of the fox as the equivalent of a cat.
I mean, and it's interesting, you know, the way that you were sort of describing the different ways that Aesop himself is described. I mean, we do see connections there, right? Between the trickster, being smart, taking different forms, maybe looking a little varied, right? So I think in your paper that you shared, I think last year, it's available on the CHS website, in which you discuss Aesop. You talk about the different adjectives to describe the fox and the jackal, right? And some of those are poikilos, right, which is variegated, kind of
Right.
colored.
Right. This is also another point of comparison with Socrates, where the Greeks had this idea that if you were really smart, the gods would insist that you not be beautiful, because that would be giving too much to one person.
Okay, so that's interesting as we think about Socrates, right?
Right. I mean, have you seen some of those impressions of Socrates? He's not exactly. He's very how shall I say, round-faced and a little bit on the pug-nosed side.
Neat. Okay. Do we have any other questions on this focus passage? Georgia, I think, has something. Yes.
May I try to talk? Does it come across? Okay, focusing on the focus passage, I was very intrigued by the fact that the fables do visit Aesop because they're fond of him because he takes care of them. And I see here actually an effort to take genre that they are to something else, in a way to acclaim another value, another status. And Philostratus, actually in the life of Polonius, of the seven sages, you know, Polonius uses a story about Aesop to make this short. I mean, I'm sure you can elaborate later. That Aesop went to Hermes to claim to get wisdom, and by the time, as a shepherd, by the time Hermes was about to honor him with something, he didn't have anything but the tales he remembered from his nurse. This is a link then to the children. This is the first thing. And he said, I give you what I learned first. And he doesn't downplay it. So I'm going back to what you implied before. There is, I think that there is, and it's not my terminology, these little and great traditions, meaning humble origin people addressed to the public as not a popular culture, but in a massive culture, and the noble, the great tradition addressing nobility, making the link about how to deal with everyday life, how to survive it. Yeah. That would be my.
I think that's an excellent point, and we noticed that Aesop is very good at advising even royalty, even kings, but that he kind of needs a certain independence so that he can come and go as he pleases. And I think this is part of his belonging to that general community of the seven sages, even though he is not usually named as one of them himself. And I have a theory, if you want to hear it, about, so here's my idea, which I'm working on an article regarding this idea. And my theory is that he's, how shall I put this, a semi-spiritual figure, kind of like in the Indian tradition, all right? Because when we say seven sages, you know, we mean like sophoi or some word like that in Greek, right? The wise men. But in India, when we say the seven sages, we use the word rishi, which is one of the categories of the priest class of the Brahmins, okay? And there are so many similarities to the way that Aesop behaves and what these rishis are allowed to do compared to other Brahmins, that I'm pretty much heading him towards this subcategory of a spiritual figure.
Wow. And so when you say spiritual figure, I'm thinking about maybe the idea of awakening, right? Is that kind of?
Well, that's a fascinating idea, the idea of awakening, especially awakening possibilities in the minds of his audience, right? And people listening to a fable and saying, oh, that's how things could be, or, oh, we don't even have to worry about the crisis that we're in, right? We have so many options because animals wander around and do things, so could we, okay? The way I was thinking about it is actually from the passage by Philostratus that we just heard read by Sarah. And in this passage, there's the kind of spotlight put on Aesop, right? At the moment where Philostratus says that he's smiling a little bit and his eyes are looking down at the ground. Therefore, he's in the midst of composing a fable, right? And so some of the language that he uses here, to me, kind of moves us towards the idea of a form of contemplation, a form of mindfulness, if you will, which also implies the lack of restraint or constraint upon oneself, so that his imagination is opened up and his soul is at ease while he goes about the process of composing a fable. Oh, you're muted.
I did it the wrong direction. That's super fascinating, the idea of looking for a lack of restraint. But, I'm wondering, could we maybe move on to passage 2?
Sure.
Just because I'm looking at the time, and I want to get through these because you have a lot to teach us here. Sarah, you want to try passage 2?
Okay. A fox, driven by hunger, spied in the hollow of the root of an oak tree bread and meat left behind by some shepherds, entered this place and devoured, ate it down. Having her stood up, and she is not able to exit, was groaning and lamenting her fate. Passing by, she heard her sighing, approached, and on learning what had happened, she said to her companion, "But you must remain there until you become such as you were when you entered, and in this way will you slowly come out."
Okay, now can I just say, when you were talking about lack of restraint, because I read these focus passages ahead of time, I mean, it seems to me restraint is a really interesting thing to be thinking about now as we're going to read these passages, because we're going to see more and more of this. So how can we think about this passage and understand that?
Well, so here what I would like to suggest is that the language, the Greek vocabulary, the meaningfulness of the Greek allows for 2 layers of reading. And one is the fable that we just heard, which is the fox who, finally finds some food after, scavenging for hours or days or something, and just eating it all at once, right? Which leaves no opportunity for its next step. Right? The other level at which we can read the Greek is the idea of not just one's stomach, but one's ego being inflated, and therefore driving one into a corner out of which one cannot escape. How convenient is that?
I mean, that's amazing because, it's so interesting because on the one hand, it's saying if you don't provide restraint, right, then the restraint will be forced upon you in some way, or you will be more restricted. Huh.
Very true.
Okay. Any thoughts about this passage, guys? Anything jumping out at anyone about this language or what's happening? Or maybe it would be helpful just to get another comparison by reading the next passage. Yeah, why don't we move ahead? Sarah, you were breaking up a little bit. Is anyone getting echo while I'm talking? I'm not the best reader, but maybe I'll give it a shot, okay? So I'm going to read focus passage 3. An old oak tree had a hollow in the root. In the hollow lay the leather pouch of a rugged goatherd, all full of stale bread and meat. A fox ran in and ate up this pouch. Her stomach, as is likely, was inflated, and she no longer had the ability to get out of the narrow hole. Another fox approached, the one weeping, and mockingly said, Stay until you're hungry. You will not go out until first you have your stomach as big as when you entered. And so that's from Babrius. Am I saying that right?
Fabrius?
Babrius. Mythiambi Aesopi 86. I'm sure I just mangled that, but just to give people context. Okay, so here we have another example. So we have sort of the same fable, really, in many ways, from a different tradition.
A different tradition, at least a different time period. One of the things that I like about these two stories is that we have an observer, right? We have a second character who is just like kind of hanging out and like, observing the poor person in the dilemma, the poor fox who's stuck. And in the first the second focus passage, the observer has, in terms of the language, there's a tendency that the observer could be the same fox, kind of standing back and thinking about her own situation, right? And then in the focus passage 3, we see that the observer really does not have any compassion for the poor lamenting figure. So there too, we could say it's the same person, except there's a little bit more harshness to the observation, the criticism.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just wondering if you could just speak for a brief second just about the multiform nature of these fables. I mean, is that part of the tradition, right, generally, or is that just something specific to this particular fable?
Actually, the focus passage 3 that we read, this one comes from a collection that one scholar has suggested was actually used as a kind of source book for orators. And therefore, they could read the line at the top and know what the story was going to be about and how they could use the example in their persuasive speeches. So that's why there is the multiform effect of the meanings.
For all the different situations, right?
Right.
Okay. That's amazing. Anyone else? What's coming out for people now? I mean, how about there are a few differences here. How about the pouch? I think that's the difference between the two versions, right?
If I remember correctly, one issue was that whether one ate the entire pouch as well, the bread and the meat.
Yeah.
Or if there were.
Right. Well, I'm thinking because I'm kind of thinking ahead to the next passage, the one with the drum. Will we get there? Is that next? Yeah. Well, let's get to that, and then maybe we'll talk about the pouch, the idea of eating inedible things. Shall we go to that? Oh, Tim has a comment. He said, "I thought that is interesting that a fox, commenting on a fox, not another animal or Aesop. The animals in the fables have personalities, but I think we bring the character to the fable." You want to say a little bit more about that, Tim? Want to give it a shot? I don't think we have echo right now.
Okay. Any echo? All right. I just thought it was interesting. The fables, by their nature, are very snappy and short, right? They don't do any character development, yet the donkey is a specific character to us, and the horse is a character, and the sheep. So we're bringing, I don't know how to describe it, but we bring what we think the characteristics of a sheep or a horse are to the story. So in this case, we bring what we think is a fox, whatever that is, and in this case, a fox is commenting on a fox. It's not a tortoise commenting on a fox. That wouldn't have the same impact, right? And one of the interesting things from Heroes X was, they were trying to teach us not to read in to the texts. And here I'm looking at this going, exactly how much am I reading into this? Am I thinking of a fox the same way that the original heroes of this would think of a fox? I don't know. Maybe because the fables are so powerful.
No, it's interesting that you say this because many scholars consider fables a sub-literary form. And that means that the plot line, the action of this folklore form is so simple that we are almost expected to read into it, right? And if you remember what Claudia mentioned at the beginning, that one of the ways of describing a fox in Greek is poikilos, kind of like Odysseus, right? Is poikilos, the variegated mind, the mind that's always turning, the mind that has different colors coming out of its idea spectrum, right? And so, in a way, to me at least, it makes sense that it's the fox whose, shall I say, her smart aleck nature gets her in trouble. And then it's the next smart aleck who comes along and says, ha, ha, look at what you did.
Yeah, it's much more powerful than, say, the lion commenting or something, right?
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. I think Janet had a comment.
I think I have echo. Oh, maybe not. Okay. I was wondering about the oppositions of animals. Very strong animal like lion versus mouse, and at the end, it's not the size, but something else. The power comes from different sources. Also, can you talk about nature nurture in these fables?
Well, it's interesting that you would say this, because after all, if we let our children loose on these stories, they might be a little, upset and not sleep well at night. So we give them like nicer versions of the stories, kind of like with fairy tales, right? Can I also, while I'm saying this, recommend Toni Morrison has done modern versions of a few Aesopic fables, including the Ant and the Grasshopper and a couple of others. And those are very lovely, very aesthetically pleasing, very lively and human and understandable, as opposed to this kind of critique of one character by the other. Okay. So in terms of nature versus nurture, again, I would say it's a half-finished form. So the performance of the fable should require the filling in of these kinds of gaps, the creation of either humor or the distance from the narrator and the character, so that we're allowed to bring in many, many more human understanding and human emotion, rather than just be kind of leave the characters to the mercy of the elements or to the mercy of the predators.
So I think what our conversation is really sort of leading us towards Focus Passage 4, because it does address many of these issues about nature and nurture, about that distinction between, maybe animals who are in more power, animals who typically are maybe lower on the hierarchy. And Tim, I thought your point about the nature of a fox commenting upon a fox was really fascinating. I want to think some more about that. In this story, we're going to have a little bit of a distinction, right? We're going to have some power struggle between sort of animals at different levels. Does anyone want to read passage 4 for us?
Yes.
Maria? Great.
Yes. Okay, wait a minute.
Oh, I think you're muted, Maria. Yeah, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Wait a minute. So this, sorry for my belated. So the passage is. Which one is that?
Focus Passage 4 in a certain region was a jackal.
I can't trace it. Is it possible someone just?
Oh, did you have a comment? I'm sorry. Did I call on you to read when you had a comment or a question? Is that what happened?
Yeah. Is it possible?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Okay, go ahead with your comment, and then I'll read the next passage. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I would like just not a comment, actually, a question about Arti's wonderful presentation. Well, she said about, and she can probably elaborate on that later on. I would like to hear more about the fables. She discussed about fables like being like I don't know how you actually you formulated Arti, like small stories, pre-existing stories. Is that what you said?
I might have said that they're subpar, that they're not a real literary form, but they're waiting to be elaborated into a literary narrative.
So is it possible to give us some more feedback about how modern scholarship perceives these stories in waiting, if we may say so, being, and what is their connection to the social history or social real life in a way?
Okay, that would be great. And I think that's an excellent question, and it really makes me want to go back to like 3rd century BC Greece and and see fables being performed. But if you remember Focus Passage 3, that one was indeed a little bit on the less completed, the less ornamented style of story. And this is the one where Ben Edwin Perry made the suggestion in about more than 30 years ago that probably these fables were part of a rhetorical source book, so that somebody who was intending to speak in public could like do an index search, you know, based on the first sentence, and then say, oh, this story will be the one I can use in my speech. Is that speaking to what you were?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
I'm not sure how much more we can add. Think about how when you tell stories to a child, right? Will the child be satisfied if we just give a bare bones version of the story, or do they require further entertainment? At least pictures, if not you know, details of narrative.
Okay.
Right. So that
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Can we go to passage 4, because I want to get through these, because there's a great punchline at the end, actually. So I'll just read quickly. Is that okay? In a certain region was a jackal whose throat was pinched by hunger. While wandering in search of food, he came upon a king's battleground in the midst of a forest, and as he lingered a moment there, he heard a great sound. This sound troubled his heart exceedingly, so he fell into deep dejection and said, "Ah me, disaster is upon me. I am as good as dead already. Who made that sound? What kind of creature?" But on peering about, he spied a war drum that looked like a mountain peak, and he thought, was that sound its natural voice, or was it induced from without? Now, when the drum was struck by the tips of grasses swaying in the wind, it made the sound, but was dumb at other times. So he recognized its helplessness, and crept quite near. Indeed, his curiosity led him to strike it himself on both heads, and he became gleeful at the thought, "Aha! After long waiting, food comes even to me, for this is sure to be stuffed with meat and fat." Having come to this conclusion, he picked a spot, gnawed a hole, and crept in. And though the leather covering was tough, still he had the luck not to break his teeth, but he was disappointed to find it pure wood and skin, and recited a stanza. Its voice was fierce. I thought it stuffed with fat, so crept within, and there I did not find a thing except some wood and skin. So he backed out, laughing to himself, and said, I thought at first that was full of fat. Okay, so how about this drum passage? So this is another scenario, right?
Definitely. Does it remind anybody of this little trickster guy named Prometheus? And his offering of the skin and bones to Zeus?
Oh,
right?
Wow, wow. Okay, can you just give us a little, maybe 60-second reminder of that for people who maybe don't know that story?
Sure. So this is in the time of the formation of the universe according to Hesiod in a couple of his epics, the Theogony and the Works and Days, where gods and humans still interacted, and Zeus is just about coming to power, and he and Prometheus are kind of gathered on Mount Mycenae to perform the first sacrifice, which will establish the charter myth of the sacrifice for human beings. And Prometheus is the one who is divvying up the spoils, so to speak. And, you know, since he has a certain partiality for human beings, kind of like Aesop himself, in fact, he decides that rather than, you know, making equal portions, he takes one part and it's all skin, and I don't know what's the inedible part, but, you know, the skin.
It's bone thighs or something wrapped in the fat, right?
Right. And he goes to Zeus and he says, "Here, Zeus, I divided it, you choose." And Zeus knows something is up. Again, the kind of intelligence at work, but he can't quite tell what the right answer is. So he goes ahead and picks the skin, which he can see, and underneath will be only bones. Right? So this is kind of what happens to this poor jackal, where he's thinking, because of all the ruckus that's going on, the noise that is being made by the wind striking the drum, right? And maybe even, who knows, the smell of the leather or something like that. He's thinking, here I have found my dinner or my meal for several days to come, right? And unfortunately what happens is that he creeps into the drum and he's like sniffing around, where's the food, where's the food? And there's nothing there, right? It's skin and bones, so to speak.
Mm. And then it's an occasion for making a poem. Right.
Yes. Okay, so this goes back to this question of whether the fable is a bare bones story, so to speak, or if it's highly ornamented. And in the Indian tradition, with the fable collections, like this one comes from the Panchatantra, the collection of 5 treatises of collections of fables. In the Indian tradition, the stories are highly ornamented. They're very full of rhetorical and poetic devices, including, as you see, the quotation by the jackal of all people of a line of verse.
Mm. Mm. Wow. Okay, so, you know, thinking about, remember, Tim was reminding us that we don't want to read in, but I'm starting to wonder about this idea of going inside and getting greater understanding. I mean, is that something that's there, or is that just something that...
Oh, well, isn't that exactly what he does? And I should also mention that in the Sanskrit, the drum, so to speak, is considered to be female. So when he's creeping up on it, he's thinking that he's about to have him. And then he you know, carries on with the idea of food, and that also turns to naught.
Oh, wow. Okay. Let's see. So Sarah Scott is reminding us that in Old English and in Old Norse stories, the heroes often break into verse. And I think a juxtaposition between verse and prose, that's, am I correct that that's an inherent part of the Indic tradition?
Oh, most definitely. I think in the medieval studies they call it macaronic.
Oh, okay.
Where you have the movement between verse and you know, poetry and prose.
Mm. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. Any other thoughts at this point, guys? I know these passages are amazing. It's hard to rush through them. Anyone have a thought or a comment? Or shall we go on? Oh, Georgia, please. Yes.
May I shortly just share some thoughts? The one thing about not reading in, I can understand the context of the heroes, that we have a problem understanding and appreciating the concept if we project our own modern ideas. But here in the, I say it's a pretty simple story of a fox, you know, addressing a fox, and actually only a fox can know what another fox has been dealing with in this sense. So I don't think it's so, let's say, faulty to read in, and we always read in, even when we're not allowed to read in. But just the problem is, what do we read in it? About what we're not doing. Yes. This is the one. The first thought. The second thought is about ornaments of the fables and embellishing them and elaborating the text compared to the recent art, contemporary, let's say. Appreciation of stories. When you read to a child, you know, we have the supplement and the help of all the illustrations, and in a way even simple text can do the trick, while as you do it orally, really you have to create the landscape, as you nicely said. And my third and last thought, I'm very happy for your generosity for the time given, is that what you said in the beginning or in the middle about spiritual, saying Aesop as a spiritual, let's say, incentive. I like it very much, not least because of the allegories you pointed out. I mean, we know the Delphic oracle has the allegory very much in it, and actually he challenges in the life of Aesop. He challenges. I mean, the whole anecdote about the Delphians, how they were upset with him. We can read it as a challenge of this field of spirituality in Greek culture. Thank you.
I would certainly agree, and I appreciate all your comments. Thank you so much for contributing them. But what you were saying last in terms of the challenge is that, to me, it's very important that this particular type of spiritual figure is not what we would think of as a meek and mild kind of spiritual figure. And in fact, every time in the Indian tradition this kind of rishi goes off and earns some spiritual credit, if you will, or energy, they end up losing this energy because they end up getting angry at somebody, or they end up, falling in love with a courtesan. So it's very important that Aesop challenges the local tradition, and that he can't hold himself back from it. Wow. So thank you for raising that point too.
I think Helen may have a comment too about a performance tradition.
Yes, I just wanted to say that in France, we have a very strong cultural tradition with fables, and La Fontaine, which is an author, copied many of Aesop's fables, and we have a very strong tradition even now of performance. Fables are performed, and we have an actor whose name is Fabrice Lucchini, and last year and the year before, he had a theater show performing fables, and it sold out for 8 months in Paris. And he's so great. He really performs the fables. He adds, of course, all his talent to it. But we have a very strong tradition towards fables in France.
That is
not only children, adults.
Not only children, agreed.
No, adults. Yeah,
Fantastic.
We love fables.
I actually love La Fontaine's fables, and he was in a very interesting position, because he was the recipient not only of the Aesopic tradition, but he also received the Indian tradition through Marie de France.
Right.
And her reception of the Indian fables in medieval times in France. Plus, we have several people who traveled to India and returned to the court life of France, whom we know that La Fontaine had interactions with. So he has some very immediate information about the Indian angle on the stories, as well as the same kind of information at several degrees removed.
Mm-hmm. Quite interesting.
Yes, and of course, his use of philosophy and other ideas within the fable structure is so fascinating that, again, there's a form of ornamentation that is beyond just storytelling for children. Even though, once again, he dedicates his second book at least, he dedicates to the Dauphin.
Oui, right, exactly. Well, thank you so much, but we love fables, really, in France. Even in Montreal, we had a show last year about fables and classical music together, Baroque music and fables. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Arti, I see we don't have much time left. Can we go to Focus Passage 6? Maybe you would like to read this for us.
No, I would much prefer somebody who would like to. And I will warn you that is simply my memory, so.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's good. All right. Unless I see anyone raise their hand here? Shall I? All right, I'll just do it, okay? So this is Focus Passage 6, if people are following along. So Pooh stopped by his friend Rabbit's house for a visit. Reluctantly, but aware that his guest will not soon to part, Rabbit offers Pooh a snack, and Pooh silently eats his honey. After emptying the pot of honey, Pooh says his goodbyes and heads out. Unfortunately, he becomes stuck in the rabbit hole and can neither get out nor step back into the warren. Rabbit tries to push Pooh out. Piglet comes by and tries to help as well, but without success. Finally, Rabbit declares that Pooh will have to wait until his stomach settles and shrinks before they can try again. That's awesome. So, I mean, it was so great reading through these focus passages and then getting to the end and saying, of course, right? Winnie the Pooh. So help us think about that, that connection that you're finding there. I mean, it's the important messages, right? In these texts.
Certainly, the message of not being too greedy is there. I find again this idea of the creative figure that is being challenged by this circumstance, whether it's Aesop or the fox, or in this case, Winnie the Pooh. And Winnie the Pooh, in fact, we know as a bit of a poet himself. He likes to hum ditties, and he creates poems for his friends for their birthday and so on. So I would say that yes, he does represent moderation, but he's also a creative type, and maybe his excesses for, his eagerness for the honey, we can forgive, since he will, eventually get over this crisis.
Right, right. And I mean, that is something that's implied about each of these stories, right? Which is that this is not, it's not a permanent problem. Everyone is going to get out of the hole, it seems, in each of these stories, correct? Or, one even does, it seems, apparently, is entrapped, but. Which is different from Aesop, right? Which is that in the end, well, at least in some versions of his story, he is the scapegoat and doesn't escape.
Unfortunately for him, he wasn't dealing with animals, he was dealing with human beings, and they're not quite as forgiving.
Right. Okay, so let's see. Anyone have any thought about this? Rethinking Winnie the Pooh? We're thinking about these passages. We're thinking about foxes and moderation and restriction. Janet, did you have a thought about moderation?
Yes, I guess it's in our daily lives, if we let's practice moderation, but sometimes we overindulge, and hopefully we'll go back to where we are before. Yeah. Also, at the end of the story, the result of the story is not always black and white. It gives a room for us to ponder on. Perhaps children do the same thing. That's what I got from stories, some of the stories.
So there's room to reconsider the ending, I think, is what Janet's saying. And how about that, Arti? And how about the idea that, one of the things my teacher, Lenny Milner, used to talk about is that the fables oftentimes will have multiple versions of a fable with a different sort of punchline at the end, right? So some people say, well, it's all about the quote-unquote moral of the story, but sometimes you have the same moral with totally opposing morals. So how are we supposed to understand that, the ending, or how do we approach the ending of a fable?
Well, again, it should be a multiform subgenre, because if we're talking about folklore, we want it to be accessible to as many people as possible. We're not talking about just the audience of the king or the prince or somebody like that, We're talking about a large group who should be able to hear these stories and have some room for accommodating the moral for their own understanding. So even though we're suggesting that this is going too far into the fable, I'm going to stick with that idea because it's really still meant as a rhetorical device. At least a good number of the fables we have from the ancient world were being used rhetorically.
Awesome. I think Sarah has a question also about the sort of the endings.
Yeah, because in some translations we don't have just the story, but we then have an explicit, the moral of the story is whatever. So I was wondering, were those in the original added by translators who were trying to, if you haven't got it yet, this is what it's about? Were they trying to interpret for us?
Well, some of the older fables that we have actually, what they have is the last line, basically the punch line, is in the mouth of one of the animal characters. Okay, and from that, the understanding is that the moral evolved as the narrators kind of jumping back in and creating a conclusion instead of just letting the animals run freeform, so to speak.
So fascinating. So it's sort of about the author becoming part of the story when that happens.
Yes.
I hadn't thought about that. That's amazing.
Have you heard of Pirandello's 6 Characters in Search of an Author?
I don't know what's that.
Yeah, it's a 20th century play. So we have the same idea where the fable characters, these animals, are so much more charming that we almost don't care who the author is, unless, of course, it's Aesop. Right, Pirandello's.
Okay, so unfortunately, I see the time. It's 12:01, so we have reached the end of our time together. But as always, it's not the end of the discussion. Okay, we can continue the discussion on the Hour 25 website, and we invite people to do that. In our discussion forums, we can follow up on ideas that were raised here. We can continue reading about it. Do we still have a community reading coming up, guys, on Aesop, or has that already happened? Yeah, do you want to share? Anyone remember the details about that? No, okay, that's okay. If not, what we can do is just check out the Hour 25 website, okay, which has the dates and the times. Oh, great, someone's posting. It's Tuesday, the 26th at 11 EDT. So we hope you'll join us for that. And I just want to thank everyone here, Georgia, Helen, Janet, Maria, Sarah, and Tim. Thank you for joining us. And of course, Arti, thank you so much for being our guest today. It was a great pleasure talking to you about this. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
That would be so much fun. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everybody. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, so until next time, guys, stay tuned. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.